Hello and welcome back to Modern Jubilees. Today we're going to talk about something called Greater Israel. What is Greater Israel exactly, and why is everybody talking about it? So basically, there are boundaries to the land of Israel that God gives to the Israelites in the Bible. These boundaries are listed in various places, including Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Kings, and finally, Ezekiel. All these places talk about the boundaries of Israel, and they are definitely bigger than the ones you know of today. But are they as big as the ones showing up in all those pictures that people are posting everywhere? No, they're not. They're really not. So let's talk about these pictures that we're seeing all over the place. We've got pictures that are going down to the Nile Delta. Now, as we learned in other videos, this is the plot of Shem. Shem's plot does go, apparently, all the way to the Nile Delta, and everything past the Blue Nile belongs to Ham. There is this space in Africa along the eastern edge of the continent in which it still is Shem's plot. But it is not Israel's plot. That is definitely not the case. So all of these pictures where we see that Greater Israel goes all the way down to the Nile Delta, those are automatically nullified. They're wrong. They have no basis, and I understand actually where they're coming from to go towards the Nile Delta, but they're definitely wrong. That's not what the tradition says. That's not what the sages say. That's not what anyone really says. And almost everybody is well aware that the Nile Delta is not where it goes to in terms of that border. But we are going to look at the borders and understand them because we don't want to get lost with all these really wild depictions of the land that, can be used by extremists. So let's begin with Kings, Davka, because Kings talks about Solomon's reign. Now, King Solomon was the son of King David, and he had unified the kingdom. So there was one kingdom of Israel, and this was a uniting of all the 12 tribes who were more splintered before the king's period of Saul and David. So now Solomon comes in and he rules, and the nation of Israel is united. And so he goes further and makes tons of pacts with the nations around him, the kings around him. And because after all, the only reason the Israelites got a king in the first place, starting with Saul, was because they saw that all the nations around them had kings, and they said, we want to be like all the other nations and have a king instead of only prophets. So now that they had a king, Solomon connects with all the other kings. Solomon connects with the other nations. He makes pacts. He marries lots of women in order to make these pacts. And there's a great period. So we see in 1 Kings chapter 5, verses 1, 4, and 5, some insight into what it was like when Solomon ruled these lands. And Steinsaltz gives very important perspective and context, which is that not all of these nations within the boundaries that are being expressed here are under his direct rule. But they were subject to his authority, and they considered him the supreme king. So he ruled over these lands, but other people may have ruled as well, other kings, because there were other nations within these borders that are going to be expressed in terms of what Solomon ruled over. But I'm going to purposely bring in verses 4 and 5 here, which say that he controlled the whole region west of the Euphrates, all the kings west of the Euphrates from Tifsach to Gaza, and he had peace on his borders all over. All the days of Solomon, Judah and Israel, which means the 12 tribes, lived from Dan to Beersheba, the very north to the south of the plot of the Israelites that we're going to read about from the Bible. They lived throughout Judah and Israel from Dan to Beersheba, and they dwelt in safety, every family under its own vine and fig tree. So these were some happy times, these were some peaceful times, these were great times. Judah and Israel, however, lived within the boundaries of Israel, but Solomon ruled over something larger than that, much larger than that. So his rule extended over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the lands of the Philistines and the boundary of Egypt. So here's the time where we see boundary of Egypt. Boundary of Egypt can be the Nile Delta. But it's more likely to mean the Nahal or Nahar of Egypt, which is the Wadi or the river of Egypt, which when we hear that term is not referring to the Nile Delta or the Nile. It is referring to Wadi El Arish, the Rhinocerura, and that is well established. So here is the only place in Kings where it says the border of Egypt, the boundary of Egypt, that it goes until. So it's possible that he ruled, but there isn't evidence that he ruled all the way to the Nile Delta. Instead, we believe that he just ruled to the boundary with Egypt, which was classically the Wadi El Arish place. All right? So that is it for 1 Kings. That's Solomon's reign. That's that entire land. That is the greater Israel sometimes people speak about, but they're not showing you that verse 5 shows you that in these days, even when he ruled over everything west of the Euphrates, Judah and Israel lived from Dan to Beersheba. Now, they also lived, we know, actually, on the east side of the Jordan, because when the Israelites originally settled, the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh settled on the east side of the Jordan River, and it was clear that they were settling in not the promised land. They were allowed to settle there. They were given permission to settle there by Moses, but only on account that their fighters would go to the front of the line in order to fight to conquer the land of Israel from the pagan, idol-worshipping, child-sacrificing Canaanites who did not belong in that land because they were from Canaan, who was the son of Ham, and they weren't supposed to be in that land in the first place, and they were cursed, and God wanted the Israelites to conquer the land and live there and inherit it forever. All right, so that's important, just overview context. Let's start with Genesis here. So in Genesis, we have God making a covenant with Avram. So we have, Bayomahu karat Adonai et Avram brit lemor. So God is making a covenant with Avram, and he's saying, to your offspring I assign this land. And where is this land? From the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. So it makes it very clear. The river of Egypt is not the Nile. The Nile is the Gihon, but the Nahar Mitzrayim is what was classically the boundary between Israel and Egypt, and that is the Rhinocerura. The Rhinocerura starts south of Gaza along the waters, along the Great Sea, along the Mediterranean, south past the modern boundary, but only a bit past the boundary, and it makes up for it because it goes up to south of the Dead Sea, whereas the ancient boundary that was come up with as a important line that is able to connect from a water source to another water source, essentially, you see here, to the Red Sea, basically. So they go a little bit north and then they go down, and so they make the boundary that we have today that separates Israel from Egypt. And that is called this river of Egypt. And then it says all the way to the great river, which is the river Euphrates. And it makes it very clear that it's talking about the river Euphrates. Here in Genesis, we establish the great river is the Euphrates River. And that is where Abraham's plot, okay, the plot that is promised to Abraham is. It goes all the way to the Euphrates. This is promised to the children of Abraham. And I'm stressing that, obviously, for a reason. And only one opinion, Targum Yonatan, says that this is talking about the Nile, which, who knows, it could be, because for this purpose, we're just talking about what God promises to Avram. In verses 19 to 21, they list all the nations that were living there and that Abraham's children are going to conquer and live among, and that's the case because Abraham's children include the Arabs, importantly. Let's go to Exodus. Now, Exodus, we're definitely talking about only the Israelites at this point. The Israelites are coming out of Egypt, and they're going to inherit the land of Israel. God takes them with tremendous miracles. God takes them the longer route to avoid war with the Philistines, that whole area. He doesn't want to take them that direct area because he doesn't want them to have to go to war. They were just coming out of a few hundred years of slavery. They're not ready for war like today. Then they were just a slave people that were being liberated, and it was not a time for war. And so God very intentionally and clearly takes them the long way to avoid war with these people. It's written out very clearly in the Bible. So that is Exodus. I will set your borders from the Sea of Reeds, the Red Sea, to the Sea of Philistia. So that's the boundary that now we are many years later, a few hundred years later. And now it's clear that it's not just the Nachal Mitzrayim, the Wadi of Rhinoceros El Arish, but now it's basically from the Red Sea to the Sea of Philistia, meaning where the Mediterranean Sea is along the coast where the Philistines traditionally lived. And that is a connecting line between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and that is exactly the border that we have today that is already written about back in Exodus, so around 2200 BCE. So that's around 4,000 years ago, that border. And from the wilderness to the Euphrates, the wilderness is the desert area of the land of Israel, and that's all the way to the Euphrates. But how to the Euphrates, we're going to see more detailed. But it still apparently goes from the wilderness to the Euphrates, umimidbar ad hanahar. Hanahar, we learned above, when it says the river, it's talking about the great river, it's talking about the Euphrates River. So we see here a hint that the boundary of Israel is going to the Euphrates somehow. But ultimately, this is not what's written later. But here it is written that the land of Israel will go to the Euphrates. Now again, remember what we learned from King Solomon, which is that there's one area that the Israelites dwell in, and that is like the proper promised land. And then there is the greater Israel, promised land. See, none of this is about ethnic cleansing. It's not like, no Jews were allowed to live in the West Bank. No Jews were allowed to live in Gaza. No Jews are allowed to live in many, many areas that are Muslim or Arab. No Jews are allowed to live there. Judenrein. They're not allowed to live there. Whereas in Israel, you have 21% of the entire country is Arabs. I lived in northern Israel for many years. It's completely integrated. Schools are integrated. Buses are integrated. Colleges are integrated. Everything is integrated. So everyone's friends with everyone, and, some people more, some people less, but it's extremely integrated. And there isn't racism. There's no such thing as we want only Jews in this land. But here we see that there is the idea within proper Israel. We're going to see that these lands belong to the tribes, but there's also greater Israel, which could be as far as to the Nile and to the Euphrates. And that's those pictures that we see of greater Israel that are weird and jarring, but they're not saying this is going to be only Jewish or this is going to be only Israelite. This is going to be for whoever lives in it. It's just that the Israelites will have some level of control over it. And today we see how that might make sense in terms of security, because security is very, very important. And apparently you can't have these tiny, tiny, tiny borders where, the entire mountainous region belongs to people who want to kill the Israelites, and the Israelites just have this tiny coastal plain. And then the coastal plain is cut off by another coastal plain that was given away, and then it's such a mess. So defensible borders is very important, and the area where the Israelites live is not necessarily enough. So there has to be other nations and peoples that live in greater Israel, but that Israel has at least partial control over in terms of defensive abilities. So there are these two layers that we're talking about. Greater Israel, as far as the Euphrates, is talking about the influence that the Israelites need to have. They need to have control so that it can be safe. That's the important thing about verse 5, where we're talking about kings of the days of Solomon. Judah and Israel lived from Dan to Beersheba. They dwelt in safety, every family under its own vine and fig tree. The only way that they had this safety was because there was this large, large buffer zone. And King Solomon was tremendously loved and respected. He was the wisest man, the smartest man. People came from all over to ask him questions. He made tremendous pacts with people. Every indigenous person, this is my litmus test for true indigeneity. If you're an indigenous nation and an indigenous people, you know about King Solomon. You know about the time where King Solomon ruled the land of Israel and the nation of Israel and had pacts with all these nations all around. Indigenous nations remember this time and remember it fondly. Those are the indigenous people. Anyone who's trying to convince you that there was no King Solomon wasn't really an Israelite, there was no temple, all these kind of things, these are lies. These are tremendous lies, and laughable ones at that. So we're seeing the border in Exodus is simply from the wilderness to the Euphrates and from the Sea of Reeds to the Sea of Philistia. We have these two lines. And it's saying, I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hands. You will drive them out before you. And this is talking about in the time of Exodus when these Canaanites were living there. Nowadays, a lot of Semitic people live there. People from all over, Arabs, and people who do not need to be driven out unless they're enemies who wish evil upon the Israelites. Then, of course, you must rise up and destroy your enemies before they destroy you. Numbers 34, 3-12. Here's where it gets very, 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 very technical. So I'm actually going to skip Numbers for a second and just go to Deuteronomy and see Deuteronomy for a minute before we go into the very detailed Numbers. Deuteronomy 1:7 gives a general overview, so we continue to zoom in and understand what we're talking about here. It says, start out, make your way to the hill country of the Amorites and to all their neighbors. Where are you going? Go to the Arava. Where is the Arava? The deep valley running north and south of the Dead Sea. So it's the valley of the Dead Sea. It usually denotes the valley to the south, leading to the Gulf of Aqaba. The Shfela, the Judean foothills, west of the Judea-Samaria mountain range. So the Arava, the hill country, the Shfela, so it's going. The hill country would be the Jerusalem hills. This is the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. The Negev, the sea coast, the lands of the Canaanites, and the Lebanon. So it's going north now, as far as the great river Euphrates, the river Euphrates, and it makes it very clear. So this is what it's saying needs to be conquered, needs to be under the dominion and control of the Israelites ultimately. And today, with such a mess that you see, and if you want to blame this on the United States, or you want to blame this somehow on Israel or Jews, or however you want to spin this, the reality is that before 1948, there were also wars, tremendous wars and battles between tribes and peoples. And these areas of Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, which used to have so many Jews in them living among them, by the way, were all ethnically cleansed of their Jews through tremendous pogroms and persecution. They're difficult places, and until today, they're not very advanced. This is a big part of why people hate Israel and the Jews. It's just because they're successful. They're very blessed by God, and so the nation of Israel, the Israelis, the state of Israel, has been very blessed with tremendous wealth in terms of like their high-tech industry, for example. It's not a land with many resources, but they have made the most of what they have and done tremendously well. So it is a shining city on a hill. And for those who have actually visited and seen it for themselves, and especially experienced the tremendous diversity and the tremendous coexistence that really does thrive there, it's so beautiful to behold. Nothing like that exists these days anywhere in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and places where they were ethnically cleansed of their Jewish population, and they're not doing so well. They're not doing so well. And so it's saying that Israel, the nation of Israel, which was blessed and set apart and very intentionally molded and created by God, does eventually need to rule until as far as the Euphrates. But like we saw in Kings, it's saying they need to rule over that land, but not necessarily that they're settling that land. That's not the holy land, the promised land, the specific land for the tribes. The tribes have their own plots. And so there is this buffer zone around the proper land of Israel that reaches in these directions, okay, as far as the Euphrates. Arguably to the Nile in the time of Solomon, but still most people don't believe that. But it's possible because Shem's lot does go exactly to there. But either way, there's a time of peace that needs to happen. And it turns out that the Israelites are better and good at ruling over these lands, which is its ancestral land. It's indigenous to these lands. It ruled for 1,000 years during the First Temple and Second Temple period over these lands. And so it knows what it's doing. And it's proven to, if you're beyond the propaganda, it's proven to be tremendously moral. It is the most moral army. It is, honestly, of course, there are always, people who mess up and do bad things, but they will go to jail. They will go to prison. And often they'll be put there by Arab judges because that's what the society is. It's a really great society. ultimately. And I feel really bad for the people who were convinced otherwise, who obviously exist all over these social media platforms. I just feel bad because you haven't been there, you don't understand, you don't know how actually extraordinary it is there, especially in comparison with the nations and countries around it and how they're doing and how they operate and their laws and their traditions, some of which are great, but many of which are also not great. Okay, so Deuteronomy 1:7 is just giving this overview, and we looked at it. Now, Deuteronomy 2:29 also has an important point. I just wanted to bring in an example like this, but this is even part of just the general narrative of the Bible, the Pentateuch. And it says, as the descendants of Esau who dwell in Seir did for me, and the Moabites who dwell in Ar, that I may cross the Jordan into the land that the Lord our God is giving us. It's just basically saying, Asher a'avor et Yarden el haaretz, Asher Adonai Eloheinu noten lanu. Saying, I'm going to cross the Jordan into the land that God gives us. And this is part of, again, the greater narrative, which is that when the Israelites were taken out of slavery in Egypt, 2.5 of the tribes wanted to settle east of the Jordan. And Moses was just like, what? Because they wanted to settle there. Their flocks really liked it there. It was great for grazing. But basically the deal they had to make was that they were going to go to the front lines and fight to actually conquer the proper land of Israel in order to settle those lands that they wanted to settle. Meaning that those lands that they settled were not part of proper Israel. And so that's important to note, because we're trying to understand there's a difference between greater Israel, meaning what Israel should have dominion over in terms of defense and in terms of rule for the good of the populace of the area, and what should be the proper land of Israel, the Holy Land, the Promised Land, the land of the 12 tribes in which they should settle, in which their plots were drawn out in the books of the prophets as well, but we're not going to get into here. That is it for Deuteronomy. I just wanted to show an example where the idea is to cross the Jordan into the land that God is giving us. All right, and then Ezekiel is here also. We're going to look at after and compare it very briefly with what we have from Numbers. Basically, Numbers and Ezekiel are the most broken down in terms of what these borders actually are and what the limits are. But Ezekiel is more clear that west of the Jordan River is belonging to Israel, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. All right, let's look at Numbers real quick. Your southern sector shall extend from the wilderness of Tzin alongside Edom. Your southern border to the east shall be the edge of the Dead Sea. Tzin is southwest of the Dead Sea, the southern border of Judah's plot. By the way, the tense here, just so it's clear, it's not saying in the future, it's not saying in the present, it's not command. The tense in terms of English is all of the above. It's a divine tense. In Hebrew, it's unique tense. It's positive, affirmative, present, future, and eternal. That's how I would explain the tense. So the southern sector, wilderness of Tzin, Dead Sea, this is the general idea. It will then turn south. So basically, there again, it goes to all the way Wadi El Arish, but there's an ancient boundary that was created as sort of a compromise in the middle of all of this, which is the border that we have today. The border will then turn to pass south of the Akrabim with the Scorpion Pass, as it's known. It will continue to Tzin. Its southernmost limit will be Kadesh Barnea, and then extend to Chatzar Adar and reach as far as Atzmon. These are all areas down there where this border is that we know of today. From Atzmon, the boundary will turn north and follow the Egyptian Wadi. So that is Wadi El Arish, which will be its far border to the west. The western border will be the Great Sea, the Mediterranean, and its shores. That will serve as your western border. This will be your northern boundary. Draw a line from the Great Sea, straight is the idea, to Mount Hor. Mount Hor is in southernmost Turkey. So it's all the way up past Lebanon. And from Mount Hor, draw a line to Levochamat so that the extreme edge of the boundary is towards Sedad, and these are areas in Syria. The border will then extend to Zifron with its extreme end in Chatzarinan. This will be your northern border. These are 2 oases in Syria. For your eastern boundary, draw a line from Chatzarinan to Shefam, which is a hill town in the anti-Lebanon mountain range. The boundary will then run southward. So in this very detailed map here, we have essentially where they settled but not that it goes to the Euphrates, because it's talking about the proper boundaries of Israel. The boundary will then run southward from Shepham to Rivla to the east of Ain. Ain is a spring. Continuing south, the boundary shall run along the eastern shore of the Kinneret, which is the Sea of Galilee. Rivla is the capital of Hamat, near Rible, the bank of Orontes, 30 kilometers south of Homs. The boundary will then continue south along the Jordan, continuing until the Dead Sea. So the boundary here is very clearly the Jordan, but it is going up north much higher. All these shall be your land as defined by its boundaries on all sides. And in Ezekiel, we have something very similar. The northern limit is from the Great Sea, also by way of these areas, Levo Hamat. It's telling you all the borders, the border of Damascus, the border of Hamat, on the border of Horan. So this is areas of Syria and Lebanon reaching to the, basically touching Turkey's border, is Greater Israel, and that's Ezekiel. So I just want you to understand it's never going to go higher than these areas that I'm talking about. It's never going to go past it in any direction, ever. These are the borders, these are the boundaries. Yes, it's bigger than today's Israel, but it's not what people are showing as if this is, the intention of Israel to kick everyone out, which already should put up flags because, again, a fifth of the modern country of Israel, which doesn't even include large portions of the West Bank and all of Gaza right now, are Israelis mixed with Arabs. 20% is Arabs. Christians, Muslims, Druze, Bedouins. They have full rights. They serve on the Supreme Courts. They serve in the military. They serve in the hospitals. They go to the same schools. It's very, very integrated, and it's a beautiful society. I've lived in it. And so it's very, very sad, the misconception that's out there about Israel, whereas in places like Gaza or these areas that are controlled by the Palestinian Authority, it's Judenrein. No Jews are allowed there. And that's what you have these days, again, in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq. Judenrein. You don't have Jews living there because of all the pogroms and the violence that was directed against the Jews. They lost out because Jews are smart and successful, tend to be. And so they bring luck, they bring blessing, and they help out where they are. And it's a great loss. And you see movements within places like Syria and Iraq that mourn, that learn and understand. In Egypt too. People grow up and understand, wow, we used to have an enormous Jewish population here. What happened to them? And then they learn about what happened to them, and it's a very sad thing to face. So I just want to, again, clarify that none of these borders and the reality, there might be extremists who say mean things, on X, and don't put too much attention to them. That's not what Israel is about. That's not what the Bible is about. And at the end of the day, Israel, it needs to be tied to the Bible. That's what this entire thing comes down to. The border between Damascus and Hamat, which is the An-Nusayriya mountains of Syria. The boundary will run from the Sea of Hazor Enon to the north of the territory of Damascus. That will be the northern limit. The eastern limit, a line between Horan and Damascus, and between Gilad and Israel, with Jordan as a boundary, measured down to the eastern sea. Here it's very clear that Jordan is the boundary. And so it's very, very overlapping ideas, and the southern limit will be along the Wadi of Egypt, Nachal Mitzrayim, and the Great Sea. This is the southern limit. The agreed upon clear southern limit is the Wadi El Arish, the Rhino Kurura, and the western limit is the Great Sea, opposite Levo Hamat. This land you shall divide for yourself among the tribes of Israel. So if we want to zoom out into the bigger picture, we're going from the river of Egypt, which is the Rhino Kurura, to the great river, the Euphrates. So as far as that, no farther ever, as far as that. But some of that could be, of course, populated by other tribes and nations and peoples that live there. There's no idea that you need to kick out the Semites who are living there. No. The idea in this time of the Bible was to kick out the Canaanites, who were Hamites, who had settled in the land when they weren't supposed to, and who were doing terrible things. Nowadays, when you have monotheism, what it comes down to is we're having a family dispute that needs to be ironed out, and it's been blown way out of proportion by bad people with bad intentions, greedy people. And then from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea is one border, so that's the river of Egypt, essentially, and it goes along the Jordan River until the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, where it goes towards the Euphrates, and up as far as the bottom tip of Turkey. All right, so that is the review of the Greater Israel boundaries, the boundaries of the land of Israel, the Holy Land. I've been wanting to do this for a really long time. I hope that this is clear for all of us to learn from so that nobody convinces anyone otherwise and there isn't confusion. These texts might be old, they might be archaic, but at the end of the day, they are very, very important and they are still relevant today, and they are the basis of the Israelite society that we have. And this is just one reminder with all the current events going on that Israelites, Arabs, Muslims, Jews are not enemies. We are actually the best of friends. We are the closest of family. We are the closest of faith communities. Those who try to divide us, those who try to pit us at war with one another, are our mutual enemies who do not understand the ways of God, the Bible, the Exodus, the miracles of Moses, who do not understand, who are in darkness. And that is the reality, and that is what we need to focus on. Do not fall prey to those who wish to incite you towards hatred and war and killing and all this terrible stuff. The Israelite nation must rule in the land of Israel, and the Israelite nation is made up of Jews from the kingdom of Judea, as well as all of these lost tribes and Bani Israel and people from around the world who are also part of the people of Israel, who also are welcome to rejoin the land of Israel. Those who want peace are friends and allies of Israel, and those who do not are the enemies. And so the enemies must be dealt with strongly so that we avoid any such things as we've seen in the past, both on October 7th and before it. And so with that is just a important reminder that there is an allyship going on. There is a greater Israel. The idea of greater Israel is not just the people of Israel, not just the minorities of Israel, but also the allies of Israel, the people who recognize that God set apart this nation for a specific purpose and blessed this nation and said that those who bless this nation are blessed and those who curse it are cursed. Those who love the nation of Israel are loved back, are loved in return, and are respected and appreciated in return. And that is the world that we wish to build. This area of King Solomon's reign and domain is a testament to how the nation of Israel was at its peak when it was a shining light and a beacon of hope and a uniting nation that united all the indigenous peoples in the areas around it, and all indigenous peoples and cultures remember this time fondly. All right, so let's leave it there for today. Thank you so much for listening and for watching. God bless you and yours, and may we all see a time of peace, order, good boundaries, and mutual understanding in the near future, God willing, Bezrat Hashem, inshallah, and we will leave it there. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. This is Modern Jubilees, and we will see you next time.